What Captain Robert Mitchell saw on that April afternoon in 1975 would haunt him for 40 years, not because of what he witnessed, but because of what he chose to do about it. The military records would never show his final flight out of Saigon. The Pentagon would have no documentation of those 53 souls he carried in a helicopter designed for 12, and for decades he would wonder if he had made the right choice, or simply gotten lucky that they all survived. Mitchell was 32 years old, and on his third tour in Vietnam when everything started falling apart in those final days of April. Tan Son Nhut Air Base had become a nightmare of chaos and desperation as North Vietnamese forces closed in on Saigon. The Huey helicopters were flying non-stop evacuation runs, lifting off from embassy rooftops and landing zones throughout the city, each pilot knowing they were witnessing the end of something that had consumed so many lives over so many years. Mitchell had already completed 3 runs that morning, ferrying American diplomats and military personnel from various extraction points to the offshore fleet. Each time his helicopter touched down somewhere in the city, desperate people would surge forward, hands reaching upward, voices pleading in Vietnamese and broken English. His co-pilot Steve Warner, a 24-year-old kid from Nebraska with a wife and infant son back home, had to physically push people back from the doors because they simply could not take everyone. The weight of those faces stayed with Mitchell between flights. The elderly Vietnamese man who had worked as a translator for American forces, the young mother clutching 2 children, the former South Vietnamese army officer who knew exactly what would happen to him when the North took control. Every person left behind felt like a personal failure, even though Mitchell understood the cold mathematics of helicopter capacity and fuel loads. His Huey could safely carry 12 passengers plus crew. Pushing beyond that meant risking everyone on board. But mathematics felt meaningless when you looked into the eyes of someone who knew they were being left to an uncertain fate. It was 14:30 hours when Mitchell landed back at the base for refueling, and found a middle-aged American civilian waiting near his helicopter. The man wore a sweat-stained white shirt and had that particular blend of exhaustion and urgency that marked CIA personnel in those final days. He did not show identification, and Mitchell did not ask for any. The man simply handed him a piece of paper with an address scrawled on it. The location was in the southern part of Saigon, outside the designated military zones, in a neighborhood that was not on any official evacuation list. The man explained that an orphanage operated by American nuns was there with approximately 40 children, all of them half-American kids, who had been abandoned or orphaned during the war. No one was coming to get them. The official evacuation was focused on American citizens and high-priority Vietnamese nationals. A building full of mixed-race orphans did not make the list. Mitchell looked at the address and then back at the man. He asked if this was an official order, and the man shook his head slowly. This conversation was not happening. There would be no record of it, but those children would not survive what was coming if someone did not get them out. The North Vietnamese forces had shown little mercy to those associated with Americans, and mixed-race children were visible evidence of American presence. Mitchell understood what the man was not saying explicitly. He turned to Warner and explained the situation. Warner was young and had everything to lose, a family waiting for him, a future beyond this war. Mitchell told him this was not an official mission, and there would be no recognition for it. Possibly even consequences if things went wrong. Warner looked at the address, then at Mitchell, and said they should go. The helicopter lifted off at 15:10 hours. Mitchell radioed the control tower and reported a routine patrol flight to check on some outlying areas. In reality, they were heading south into neighborhoods that were rapidly falling into chaos as residents tried to flee before the North Vietnamese arrival. Mitchell kept the Huey low, watching the streets below fill with people, vehicles, belongings piled onto carts and motorcycles. He could see North Vietnamese military convoys in the distance, the unmistakable shape of tanks and troop carriers moving steadily toward the city center. Time was running out faster than anyone in command wanted to admit. Finding the orphanage took 20 minutes of searching through unmarked streets. It was a 3-story white building, with a cross mounted on the roof and a small courtyard where 2 American nuns were trying to organize a group of children. Mitchell brought the Huey down in the courtyard, the rotor wash sending dust and debris swirling. One of the nuns ran toward the helicopter as soon as the skids touched ground. She was shouting something, but the rotor noise drowned out her words. Mitchell could see the relief and desperation on her face. She had been waiting for help that she must have feared would never come. When Mitchell climbed out and approached the building, he saw the full scope of what he had agreed to do. There were not 40 children. There were 53. They ranged in age from toddlers barely able to walk to adolescents of 12 or 13. All of them showed signs of malnutrition and stress. Many were crying. The older ones tried to comfort the younger ones, but their own fear was visible in their eyes. Mitchell looked at his helicopter and did the mental calculation. There was no calculation that made this work. A Huey designed for 12 passengers, loaded with 53 children, plus 2 nuns plus crew, in hot weather conditions that reduced lift capacity, trying to fly to a carrier fleet offshore. Every aspect of flight safety said this was impossible. Warner came up beside him, and Mitchell could see his co-pilot making the same calculations. Warner asked how they were going to do this, and Mitchell said they would figure it out as they went. The truth was he did not know if they could do it at all, but he knew with certainty that leaving any of these children behind was not an option he could live with. The nuns explained that these were all children of American servicemen and Vietnamese mothers. Some had been left at the orphanage by mothers who could not care for them. Others had been found abandoned after their mothers died or disappeared. The Vietnamese government would not evacuate them because of their mixed heritage. The American government had not included them in official evacuation plans because they were not American citizens. They existed in a bureaucratic gap that would cost them their lives if someone did not act. Mitchell began loading children into the helicopter. He put 2 small children in each seat, then started placing others on the cargo floor in the rear compartment. The nuns climbed aboard and held infants and toddlers on their laps. Mitchell worked methodically, trying to distribute weight evenly, but there were still 15 children standing in the courtyard when every available space seemed filled. Warner looked at Mitchell and shook his head slightly. They both knew what happened when you exceeded weight capacity. The helicopter became sluggish, difficult to control, and if anything went wrong there would be no margin for error. But Mitchell looked at those 15 children and made a decision that defied every regulation and safety protocol he had ever learned. He told the remaining children to sit on the metal floor of the cargo area. They would have no seats, no restraints, just the floor and each other. Warner started to object, pointing out that turbulence or sudden maneuvers could throw them around the cargo bay, that they could be seriously injured or worse. Mitchell understood all of that. He also understood that certain death waited for them if they stayed. He asked Warner directly if he could live with leaving them behind, and Warner stopped arguing. The oldest child was a girl of about 12 with dark eyes that held far too much understanding of the world. She organized the younger ones, getting them to sit in a tight group, arms linked together. She positioned herself at the center of the group and looked up at Mitchell with an expression that cut through him. She was not pleading or crying. She was simply waiting to see if this American pilot was going to save them or abandon them like so many others had. Mitchell crouched down next to her and told her to keep the little ones calm and together no matter what happened during the flight. She nodded and tightened her grip on the children around her. The helicopter lifted off at 15:47 hours, struggling under a load that exceeded its design limits by at least 50%. The turbine engine strained, and the rotor blades made a different sound than normal, a heavier thump that Mitchell could feel through the controls. Warner watched the instruments carefully as Mitchell worked the throttle and collective, trying to coax the overloaded Huey into the air. The helicopter shuddered, and the children in the back screamed as they felt the aircraft sway uncertainly. One of the nuns called out for everyone to stay calm and pray. Mitchell was not particularly religious, but he found himself hoping that any available deity was paying attention. The first 200 meters were the most critical. The helicopter was heavy and sluggish, responding slowly to control inputs. Mitchell kept it low, building airspeed gradually rather than trying to climb steeply. The engine temperature was already higher than normal, and they had not even cleared the city yet. Warner checked the fuel consumption rate and reported that they were burning fuel much faster than standard flight profiles. The offshore fleet where they needed to land was approximately 30 minutes away at normal cruise speed. With this load and fuel burn rate, they might not have 30 minutes of flight time available. Mitchell told Warner they would make it work, because there was no alternative. In reality, he was calculating contingency options as they flew. They passed over streets, packed with fleeing civilians, over abandoned vehicles and buildings already showing signs of looting. Some people below waved at the helicopter, and Mitchell wondered if they thought it was coming to pick them up, if they understood that this one aircraft was already carrying more souls than it safely could. He focused on the flight path and tried not to think about all the people he could not help. At 16:15 hours, the engine began showing signs of serious distress. The oil pressure dropped noticeably, and the temperature climbed into the red zone. Warner reported that they were experiencing engine stress beyond normal parameters, and that continued operation at current load might result in catastrophic failure. Mitchell asked how much time they had, and Warner estimated 10 to 15 minutes before the engine seized completely. They were still at least 25 minutes from Tan Son Nhut Air Base. Mitchell considered trying to make it back to the base, but the math did not work. They needed a closer landing option. He changed course toward the coast, where the American naval fleet waited offshore. The U.S. Midway was the closest carrier, and Mitchell knew it had a small helicopter landing area on the deck. Carriers were not designed for Huey operations. The landing zone was barely large enough and positioned dangerously close to the superstructure, but it was their only realistic option. Warner understood immediately what Mitchell was planning and opened the radio channel to contact Midway Flight Control. He explained their situation, an overloaded civilian evacuation flight with engine failure developing, requesting emergency landing clearance. The response from Midway was immediate and negative. They were not authorized to land. The carrier was conducting fixed-wing operations and could not accommodate a helicopter. They needed to return to their departure field. Warner tried to explain that returning to the departure field was not possible, that they would not make it, that they had 53 children aboard who would die if they went down in the water. The radio officer on Midway repeated the denial of landing clearance and advised them to ditch near the fleet, where rescue boats could pick up survivors. Mitchell took the radio handset from Warner and identified himself by rank and name. He stated clearly that his engine was failing, that he was carrying 53 orphan children, and that he was going to land on the Midway whether he had clearance or not. He recommended that flight control clear the deck area because he was coming in. The radio went silent for a moment. Then a different voice came through, calmer and more senior. It was the carrier's air boss. He told Mitchell that landing was extremely inadvisable, that the Huey's rotor diameter exceeded safe clearance margins for the available deck space, that even a minor error would result in the aircraft striking the carrier's island superstructure. Mitchell acknowledged all of those risks and said he was still coming in. The air boss paused again and then told him to approach from the port side at minimum altitude and be prepared for deck crew guidance. He was getting one chance at this, and one chance only. Warner looked at Mitchell and reminded him that they had never practiced carrier landings, that the approach would be difficult in a fully functional helicopter and nearly impossible in one with a failing engine. Mitchell nodded, but kept the Huey on course toward the carrier. Behind them in the cargo area, the children had gone quiet. Even the youngest ones seemed to sense that something critical was happening. The 12-year-old girl met Mitchell's eyes in the mirror and gave him a small nod of encouragement. She was trusting him with all their lives, and he could not let her down. The USS Midway came into view at 16:34 hours. The massive carrier sat in the water like a steel island, and Mitchell could see aircraft positioned on the deck, crew members running to clear a space for his approach. The engine was making sounds that Warner said indicated imminent failure. Metal was grinding somewhere deep in the turbine assembly, and the oil pressure had dropped to nearly zero. Mitchell had to get them on the deck in the next few minutes, or they would be swimming. He approached from the port side as directed, keeping the helicopter low over the water. The carrier's deck crew signaled him in with paddles, but the margin of error was terrifyingly small. The Huey's rotor diameter was 48 feet, and the landing zone was not much larger. The carrier's island superstructure loomed to starboard, and Mitchell knew that if he drifted even slightly to the right, the rotor blades would strike metal, and they would crash on the deck. He focused entirely on the deck crew's signals and his own feel for the aircraft. Warner called out altitude and distance. 50 feet. 40 feet. The rotor wash created turbulence off the carrier's superstructure that buffeted the helicopter. Mitchell made tiny corrections with the cyclic, fighting to keep the Huey stable. 30 feet. 20 feet. The skids were almost touching the deck markers. The engine was screaming and shaking violently. Warner said they were losing power. Mitchell held the helicopter steady for one more second, and then brought it down. The skids hit the deck harder than he intended, and the helicopter bounced slightly before settling. The engine sputtered, and Mitchell immediately pulled the throttle to idle and hit the fuel cutoff. The turbine wound down, and the rotor blades slowed their rotation. For a moment there was only the sound of wind and the distant ocean, and then the cargo doors opened, and Navy personnel looked inside. They stared at the cargo of children filling every space in the helicopter. 53 kids ranging from toddlers to adolescents. 2 nuns and a crew of 2. The deck crew looked at each other in disbelief, and then started carefully removing the children from the aircraft. The little ones were crying again now that the stress of flight was over. The nuns climbed out shakily and immediately began organizing the children into groups. The deck crew brought blankets and water and tried to help calm the frightened kids. The 12-year-old girl was the last one out. She stood on the carrier deck, looking small and overwhelmed by the massive ship around her. She turned back to the helicopter, where Mitchell was still sitting in the pilot seat, hands trembling now that the adrenaline was wearing off. The girl walked back to the helicopter and stood looking up at him. She did not say anything at first. Then she put her hand over her heart and bowed her head slightly in thanks. Mitchell nodded back at her. He wanted to tell her that she was safe now, that they had made it, but his throat was too tight to speak. She seemed to understand anyway. She smiled for the first time and then rejoined the other children. Warner climbed out and walked around the helicopter, inspecting the engine. He came back, shaking his head, and reported that the engine had literally cooked itself. The oil had burned away completely, and internal components had fused together from the heat. If they had flown for even 2 more minutes, the engine would have seized mid-flight and they would have gone down in the ocean. Mitchell absorbed that information and realized how close they had come to killing everyone aboard. The line between success and catastrophe had been measured in minutes and luck. The carrier's commander called Mitchell to the bridge. An hour later, the commander was a career Navy officer who had seen extensive combat himself, and his expression was difficult to read. He informed Mitchell that he had committed multiple violations of military protocol and flight regulations. He had exceeded aircraft weight limits, flown an unauthorized mission, landed on a carrier without proper clearance, and endangered both his aircraft and the carrier. Any one of those violations could result in court-martial. Mitchell stood at attention and accepted the reprimand. He did not try to defend his actions or explain his reasoning. What he had done was either right or wrong, and no amount of explanation would change that assessment. The commander finished reading from the official report, and then looked up at Mitchell directly. He asked if Mitchell understood the severity of what he had done, and Mitchell said he did. The commander was silent for a long moment. Then he set down the report and told Mitchell that officially he would receive a written reprimand in his service record. Unofficially, the commander wanted Mitchell to know that he had just saved 53 lives that no one else seemed to care about, and that whatever the regulations said, what he had done required courage and conviction. The commander dismissed him, and Mitchell returned to the deck. That night, Mitchell sat on the carrier deck near his damaged helicopter and watched the sun set over the South China Sea. Other pilots came by to see the Huey that had carried 53 people and ask about the flight. Mitchell answered their questions but kept the details minimal. He did not feel like a hero. He felt exhausted and uncertain and deeply aware of how easily everything could have gone wrong. Warner sat with him and they talked about the children, wondering what would happen to them now, hoping that someone would take responsibility for getting them to safety in America. The 2 nuns had already begun working with Navy personnel to identify the children and determine if any had living relatives who could be contacted. The flight was never entered into official records. Pentagon documents about the fall of Saigon do not mention it. CIA files from that period contain no reference to an orphanage evacuation. The only evidence that it happened existed in the memories of the people involved and in the lives of 53 children who otherwise would not have survived. Mitchell returned to the United States 2 weeks later when the evacuation operations concluded. He was processed out of active duty and returned to civilian life. He never spoke publicly about the flight. When friends or family asked about his Vietnam service, he gave general answers about flying helicopters and being stationed in Saigon toward the end. The specifics of that last unauthorized flight remain private. Years passed, and Mitchell built a quiet life in Oregon. He worked as a civilian helicopter pilot for a logging company, got married, had 2 children of his own. Vietnam became something that existed in his past, but did not define his present. He thought about that final flight occasionally, usually late at night when sleep would not come easily. He wondered what had happened to those children, whether they had found families, whether they remembered the helicopter ride that brought them to safety. He kept the piece of paper with the orphanage address in a box with other Vietnam mementos, but never looked at it. 40 years after the fall of Saigon, Mitchell was 72 years old and retired. He lived in a small house outside Portland, and spent his days working in his garden and occasionally meeting with other Vietnam veterans. His wife had passed away 3 years earlier, and his own children were grown with families of their own. He was comfortable but increasingly aware that more of his life was behind him than ahead. The men he had served with were dying off one by one. Heart attacks and cancer, and the accumulated damage of lives lived hard. He attended funerals regularly. On a Tuesday morning in April, his doorbell rang unexpectedly. Mitchell was not expecting visitors and approached the door cautiously. When he opened it, he found a woman in her early 50s standing on his porch. She had dark hair starting to show gray and Asian features that suggested Vietnamese heritage. She looked at him nervously and asked if he was Captain Robert Mitchell who had flown helicopters in Vietnam. Mitchell confirmed that he was and asked how he could help her. The woman took a breath and told him that she had been looking for him for almost 10 years and was not sure she would ever find him. She explained that she had been one of the children in the orphanage, the 12-year-old girl who had organized the younger kids and sat with them on the helicopter floor during that final flight. Her name was Mai Chen, though she had been called Mei Li back then. She had been adopted by an American family after arriving in the United States and had grown up in California. For most of her life, she had vague memories of the helicopter evacuation but did not know the names of the pilots who had saved them. The event had been traumatic enough that she had suppressed many of the details. It was only in recent years, as she tried to piece together her own history, that she became determined to find the men who had flown that helicopter and thank them properly. Mitchell invited her inside and listened as she explained how she had tracked him down. She had started by contacting veteran organizations and aviation units that had served in Vietnam during April 1975. No one had records of the flight because it had never been officially documented. She searched through Navy records about helicopter landings on the U.S. Midway during the evacuation and found brief references to an unauthorized emergency landing. From there, she tracked down sailors who had been serving on the Midway and eventually found someone who remembered the helicopter arriving with dozens of children. That person remembered hearing the pilot's name mentioned. It had taken years of persistent searching through veteran networks and service records, but she had finally located Mitchell in Oregon. She pulled out photographs from her bag and showed them to Mitchell. The first was her adoption photo from 1975, a thin, scared-looking girl with haunted eyes. The next showed her as a teenager, starting to look more confident and healthy. Then college graduation photos, her wedding, children of her own. She had married a man whose parents had also fled Vietnam, and they had built a life together in San Francisco. She had 4 children ranging in age from 8 to 20. She worked as a social worker helping refugee families navigate the American immigration system. She showed Mitchell a recent family photo with all of them together, multiple generations of a family that existed because of decisions made 40 years ago. Mitchell looked at the photographs and felt emotion rising in his chest. This woman sitting in his living room was that frightened 12-year-old who had looked up at him with such trust and hope. She had survived and grown and built a family. He asked about the other children from that flight, and Mai told him that she had managed to locate about 30 of them over the years. Most had been adopted and raised in America. Some had struggled with the trauma of their early years. Several had died, from illness or accidents or the various ways that life could go wrong. But many had survived and thrived. She had photographs of some of them, their families, their children. One had become a doctor. Another was a teacher. Several had military careers of their own. Together, those 53 children had produced more than 200 descendants, grandchildren and great-grandchildren who would never have existed if Mitchell had followed regulations that day. May told Mitchell that she wanted him to understand the full scope of what he had done. It was not just 53 lives saved in that moment. It was generations of lives made possible. Her own children would never have been born. Her grandchildren, when they came, would never exist. Multiply that across all the survivors and their families, and the numbers became staggering. One helicopter flight, one decision to break the rules and take impossible risks, had created this expanding web of human life and experience. She wanted Mitchell to know that his choice mattered beyond what he could have possibly imagined at the time. Mitchell found it difficult to process what she was telling him. For 40 years that flight had been a private memory, something he rarely discussed, a moment of calculated risk that had fortunately worked out. He had never allowed himself to think of it as particularly heroic because the alternative would have been unconscionable. Leaving those children behind had not been a real option, so taking them aboard had simply been the only choice available. But May was showing him that the ripples from that decision had spread far beyond what he understood. She was living proof that impossible choices sometimes had to be made and that breaking rules could be the most moral action available. She asked him about Warner, his co-pilot that day, and Mitchell's expression darkened. Warner had died in a car accident in 1983, just 8 years after Vietnam. He had been 24 during that flight, barely more than a kid himself, and he had agreed without hesitation to risk everything for children he had never met. Mitchell told Mai that Warner had been the real hero of that flight. Mitchell had been the aircraft commander and made the decision, but Warner could have refused, could have reported Mitchell for suggesting an unauthorized mission, could have protected his own career and future. Instead, he had climbed into that helicopter and done his job with complete professionalism, even as they both knew they might not survive the flight. Warner had a son who would have been in his 40s now. Mitchell gave Mai his contact information so she could reach out to Warner's family if she wanted to share what his sacrifice had meant. They talked for hours that afternoon. Mai described growing up in America, the challenges of adapting to a new culture, the way her adoptive family had loved her even as she struggled with memories and trauma from her early years. She talked about eventually becoming a social worker because she wanted to help other displaced people the way she had been helped. She described meeting other survivors from that helicopter flight and the bond they shared as people who had experienced something extraordinary together. Mitchell told her about his own life after Vietnam, the difficulty of adjusting to civilian life, the nightmares that had gradually faded but never completely disappeared. He talked about the other evacuation flights he had made and the faces that still haunted him, people he had not been able to save. Before Mai left, she gave Mitchell a gift. It was a leather-bound book containing photographs and brief biographies of all 53 children from that flight. As much information as she had been able to gather over the years of searching. Each page showed what had happened to them, where they had ended up, what they had made of the second chance they were given. Some of the stories were triumphant. Others were tragic. All of them were human. Mai told Mitchell that he should know what became of the lives he saved. That they were not just statistics or abstract concepts, but real people who had lived real lives because of what he did. She asked him to remember that breaking the rules that day had been the right choice, and that following orders would have meant abandoning dozens of children to almost certain death. After Mai left, Mitchell sat alone in his living room and went through the book page by page. He saw faces that echoed that frightened 12-year-old girl, lives that had unfolded in ways both expected and surprising. He found himself crying, something he had not done in decades, overwhelmed by the weight of understanding how much had depended on decisions made in a moment of crisis. That flight had taken less than an hour, but its consequences had echoed through 4 decades and would continue long after he was gone. He thought about the military commanders who had reprimanded him, the regulations he had violated, the risk he had taken with his own life, and Warner's. He thought about how different things might have been if he had followed proper procedure, if he had reported the situation through channels and waited for authorization that would never have come. Those children would have remained in Saigon when the North Vietnamese forces arrived. What would have happened to them was not difficult to imagine. Instead, they had lived and grown and created families of their own. The mathematics of life and death that he had learned in flight school had taught him about weight limits and fuel consumption. But there was a different mathematics that involved human value and moral choice, and that calculus did not appear in any technical manual. Mitchell kept the book on his coffee table where he could see it every day. He started reaching out to some of the survivors, making contact through Mai's network, hearing their stories firsthand. Several of them visited him in Oregon. He met their children and heard about their lives. One of the survivors had become a helicopter pilot herself, inspired by the flight that had saved her. She told Mitchell that she had always wanted to thank the man who showed her that one person could make a difference. Another had named his son Robert in honor of the pilot he had never forgotten. The connections multiplied and deepened, and Mitchell found himself part of an extended family he had never known existed. In his final years, Mitchell became something of a reluctant celebrity in the veteran community, as word spread about the unauthorized flight. Military historians wanted to interview him about the fall of Saigon. Aviation enthusiasts wanted to know the technical details of how he had managed to fly an overloaded helicopter that far. Other veterans reached out to share their own stories of bending or breaking rules to do what they thought was right. Mitchell was uncomfortable with the attention, but cooperated because Mai convinced him that the story mattered, that it demonstrated something important about duty and conscience, and the difference between following orders and doing what was necessary. The unauthorized flight became something larger than the event itself. It became a story about the moral complexity of war, about the gap between institutional rules and human need, about the courage required to make impossible choices in impossible circumstances. Mitchell never claimed to be a hero. He maintained until the end that he had simply done what anyone would have done in that situation. But Mai and the other survivors knew differently. Not everyone would have taken that risk. Not everyone would have looked at 53 children and decided that saving them was worth risking everything. The fact that Mitchell thought it was an obvious choice said more about his character than he understood. When Mitchell died at age 78, his funeral was attended by more than 40 of the survivors from that flight, along with their families. Mai delivered the eulogy and talked about the pilot who had broken the rules, because following them would have meant abandoning children who had no one else to help them. She talked about the generations of life that existed because he had made that choice. She reminded everyone present that heroism was not always about following orders, but sometimes about knowing when orders were wrong and having the courage to act on that knowledge. She said that the world needed more people like Robert Mitchell, people who understood that doing the right thing was more important than doing the approved thing. The story of that final flight out of Saigon eventually became part of the historical record, though it took decades for it to be properly documented. Military historians added it to the catalog of evacuation operations, though it remained an unusual case of an unauthorized mission that violated numerous regulations but saved dozens of lives. The helicopter itself, the overloaded Huey that had barely made it to the carrier deck before its engine failed, was eventually recovered from storage and put on display at a military aviation museum. A plaque explained the story of its final flight and the pilot who had pushed it beyond all reasonable limits. Visitors to the museum would look at the small helicopter and try to imagine 53 children packed inside, try to imagine the courage required to attempt such an impossible flight, try to imagine the consequences if Mitchell had decided to follow the rules instead. Mai continued her work with refugee families and became an advocate for Vietnamese adoptees trying to connect with their heritage and history. She established a foundation in Mitchell's name that provided support for war, orphans, and refugee children around the world. The foundation's logo was a simple silhouette of a Huey helicopter with the motto "When rules fail, humanity must prevail" written beneath it. The foundation helped thousands of displaced children over the years, carrying forward the legacy of that single unauthorized flight from 1975. The story endured because it captured something essential about human nature and moral choice. It reminded people that systems and regulations and bureaucracies could not account for every situation, and that sometimes individuals had to step outside those systems to do what was necessary. It showed that courage was not just about facing enemy fire, but also about facing your own commanders and saying that their orders were wrong. It demonstrated that the most important victories were sometimes the ones that never appeared in official records. The quiet acts of defiance against indifference that saved lives one helicopter load at a time. Mitchell's unauthorized flight became a teaching case in military ethics courses, a reminder that duty to humanity could sometimes supersede duty to regulations, and that the hardest choices were often the ones that received no official recognition or approval.